So is it Ross Dellenger of Sports Illustrated? That's his name, correct, Caleb?
Yes.
I think he does a very good job. And Ross spoke with Nick Saban, and Nick Saban, I guess it was Friday afternoon, came out and detested the fact that it appeared as if Alabama had their permanent opponents set, and those would be Auburn, Tennessee, LSU. Now, I look at it from a historical perspective, and I don't see how it could be anybody else. It's got to be Alabama, Auburn, right? I mean, that they're in state. They have to be permanent opponents. I mean, duh. And it's got to be Alabama, Tennessee, because Tennessee and Alabama are one of the great fixtures in all of college football. I've said that from the get. Now, he doesn't like it because Tennessee's better now. And then it's got to be LSU, because if you want to go back even before my time, that was just slightly before my time. That was considered the great rivalry of the time in what is now the SEC West, essentially. In the western side of the conference, it was Alabama, LSU. For those that don't know and just follow Tennessee, Nick Saban going to Alabama after coaching at LSU and having success was the ultimate kick in the you-know-where to LSU fans. So let me give that some historical perspective. There's a lot of hate there. There's a lot of vitriol there. So to me, Alabama, of all of the teams out there, is the most simple. And Nick Saban can complain all he wants to, but he's also called himself a purist at times, Caleb. And if you're a purist, then Alabama's three permanent opponents have to be Auburn, Tennessee, LSU. And I don't understand how he could argue against that. He might not like it because Tennessee is good again, but I bet you if 5 years ago that these were the three permanent opponents, he's probably like, oh, okay. Yeah, no big deal. Or let's say 4 years ago, Ed Orgeron's on his way out, Tennessee's still finding themselves. He doesn't have as much of a problem with it. Now he's got a problem with it because Tennessee and LSU have great coaches in place.
So I disagree. I agree with you on one thing. I think, and this is a big, I actually think I might write this later, but every Tennessee fan should be happy that Nick Saban is complaining about this, because that means that he knows Tennessee's about to be good. Or is going to stay good. I still distinctly remember Nick Saban vociferously defending Derek Dooley as a head coach. And we all know why he was doing that. And he, as we've talked about before, coaches will only defend other coaches who are doing a terrible job at their school because they like that those coaches are there. And I don't think LSU's as necessary. And I'm a historian. I understand your point about the rivalry. I got to be honest, Dave, I think that hate's a little one-sided. I think that's like Tennessee Ole Miss back in the day. That hate, remember Ole Miss hated Tennessee, and they played every year. And so Peyton Manning going to Tennessee was a gut punch. But let's be honest, Tennessee never really cared that much about Ole Miss. Even with the whole Archie Who, Steve Kiner moment where Ole Miss won 38-0 in 1969, Ole Miss cared about Tennessee a lot more than Tennessee cared about Ole Miss. I actually think Alabama and LSU is a rivalry you could nix. I think we're just seeing that now because we're seeing Alabama under Nick Saban versus LSU, who's going to be a powerhouse program under Brian Kelly. We want to see them play every year. But, Alabama's played Mississippi State more than they played Ole Miss historically. I'm sorry, more than they played LSU historically. So I think I actually am with Nick on the fact that you could nix that rivalry. Again, I would, because my proposed format that I'm doing would nix that rivalry anyway. Because I told you, I want to just keep the two divisions, move Alabama and Auburn into the East, and you don't have any permanent cross-divisional opponents from the East and the West. And because I don't think Alabama, LSU, if you got to cut a rivalry, look, Tennessee and Florida was a rivalry that stopped the college football world in the 90s. I still don't know a rivalry that stopped the college football world the way Tennessee-Florida did in the 90s, or came close to that level of magnitude. That rivalry is going to go with this new system, and I don't think any of us have a problem with it because we know Tennessee can't play Florida every year if you just have three teams.
Okay, well, let's turn to that. I do have a problem with it. I've got a big problem with it. I've got a big problem with South Carolina being the permanent opponent. I've got a big problem with us trying to manufacture and push down a South Carolina rivalry down Tennessee's fans' throats. And listen, I don't care what happened in November of 2022. That is one game. And There is no rivalry there. There is no excitement there. That is not a rivalry. South Carolina, much like you were talking about, Ole Miss looked at maybe, did you say Ole Miss maybe looked at Tennessee as a rival at one point?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Kentucky and South Carolina are the same thing. All right, they look at Tennessee as a rival. Tennessee is not a rival. Tennessee does not look at Kentucky in football and think, oh, rivalry game. No, you don't. You don't think the same thing for South Carolina. You absolutely do not. So for to put South Carolina in there, and I know you're going to have to crack some eggs, no pun intended, to make this omelet of the expanded SEC, but it needs to be Florida. It needs to be Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, and I don't care if that's tougher or not right now.
Well, then we need to do the SEC needs to do what we have suggested, which is just do the divisions. Then you have 7 permanent opponents and 2 on the other side, and it works to pick the top 2 teams. If Alabama and Auburn move to the East and Missouri moves to the West, there's only one game you would lose. At that point, there's only one annual game you would lose that has been played at least 100 times. That's Alabama, Mississippi State. I don't think Mississippi State's going to complain about not having to play Alabama every year anymore. I think they were more than happy to get rid of that game. And yeah, you'll lose Alabama LSU. I don't think Alabama LSU is in the top 10 of like rivalry games at SEC history that people want to see. I don't. I think Ole Miss Mississippi State's better. I think LSU Ole Miss honestly is more historic. Texas Oklahoma, Arkansas Missouri.
I mean, there are a lot of directions you could go, and if you want to take it at face value and right now what's going on, then you say Tennessee, their permanent opponents, according to this report by Ross Dellenger. And I want to be clear, it wasn't a report, but I have every reason to believe this is going to be the direction that it goes because Nick Saban wouldn't comment on something he didn't feel firmly about. And I believe this was leaked to Ross. This is just my hunch. I haven't spoken to him. I don't know him. But Tennessee, their permanent opponents would be Vanderbilt, Alabama, South Carolina. Now, you have to keep Vanderbilt because they're in state. You have to keep Alabama because it is such a great rivalry. So really the only question is that third spot. And I think that should be Georgia or Florida above South Carolina because of the history. Now, that being said, Tennessee fans that are rooting for an easier schedule, this is it. Okay, so South Carolina, you would rather play South Carolina than Florida or Georgia. Don't get me wrong. You would rather have your recruiting oats sow and continue to grow in the state of South Carolina and the Carolinas in general. So you want to be there every other year as opposed to Florida where there are 500 teams battling for the same prospects and you have to overcome all of the distance in between the two schools. South Carolina ain't that far. And I'll go ahead and tell you right now, from a recruiting perspective, Tennessee would rather play South Carolina. But at the end of the day, what right is for that to be Georgia or Florida.
Let's be honest, Dave. It's the other way around that we need to look at this. They're having trouble. The SEC commissioners are having trouble finding permanent opponents for South Carolina because they're realizing outside of Georgia, no school really makes sense for South Carolina on an annual basis. What, Kentucky, maybe? I don't know. South Carolina, Kentucky rivalry? Like, there's no real rivalry for South Carolina in the SEC. And, I mean, to me, they were always more of an ACC school anyway. They struck me more as they belonged in the ACC than the SEC.
Yes. No, I completely agree. And Arkansas always felt more like a Southwest Conference school. But I don't know if they can go back and change that now, but at least Arkansas, there's some familiarity with the new teams that are coming in Texas and Oklahoma. With South Carolina, you're still like kind of the oddball team that's just kind of stuck in there. I don't know how you can fix that. Their 3 permanent opponents would be Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Well, I guess. I mean, they played them more, but
when the SEC goes to 32 or 40 teams, and they have a bunch of 8-team divisions, which they're going to do, as you talked about, then we'll see it make sense because the SEC is going to add like the North Carolina schools, Clemson, Virginia schools, and then you'll put South Carolina in the division with them.
Yeah, I mean, okay, let's just put it this way. somebody in your family is dumb and they don't understand that you don't schedule a wedding during football season, but they scheduled a wedding and you've got to sell a pair of tickets. Okay. The first ones you're going to sell for SEC tickets are going to be Vanderbilt. Okay. That's the first ones you're going to sell. The next is South Carolina. I mean, it is. I mean, who wants to go to that game? By comparison to Georgia, Florida, those are gone. It's disturbing.
You're right. South Carolina historically is a game where a Tennessee player gets to set some records and go down in NCAA lore. Whether that be Gene McKeever scoring 5 touchdowns in 1929 or T. Martin completing 23 straight passes in 1998.
A lot of passes out in the flat.
Yeah, and
a lot of screen passes there, Caleb.
I get it, but the thing that's so funny that really speaks to how bad South Carolina was that year, because there was a lot of passes out in the flat, and T. Martin still had 4 touchdown passes, and Tennessee still scored 49 points.
We're not that far removed from Brad Scott going 1-10 at South Carolina, so Tennessee should not have a rival that has ever gone 1-10.
So you're known as the resident Joe Milton hater on this show. I think you're a way bigger Shane Beamer hater.
It's not a hate thing. I don't think, and I like Joe Milton. Okay. But I just think that he's going to get overcome by Nico at some point. Now, as far as Shane Beamer, I think he's going to be coaching at Sewanee one day.
Who would you rather hire as a head coach, Shane Beamer or Les Miles?
I would take, at this day and age, I would take youth. I would take, for the recruiting perspective, I would take youth. Travis says those games will make us soft. Thank you, Travis. Thank you. Because here's the thing that Fred White said. You want to play the toughest games. Now, I could have countered with Fred, you don't want to play the toughest games because if you play the toughest games, then you could lose and be out of a 4-team playoff or a 2-team championship game. Guess what? That's not happening anymore. You've got a 12-team playoff now. You can lose 1 or 2 of those games and still make a 12-team playoff.
You could almost load management in football with a 12-team playoff. I mean, no, okay. I'm actually with you. But the thing is, like, okay, Clemson is still going to have the easiest road to this 12-team playoff that they're going to be in every year in the ACC and that ridiculous schedule. So then there'll be so much. It's not about how many you can lose. It's how fresh are you with the playoff? I mean, look, let's call it what it is. Clemson's won 2 national titles because they were just fresher than everybody else in the playoff because they didn't actually have to play anybody to get there. And I mean, that's always been my argument. Like when Boise State would beat like a Power 5 team every now and then, I'm like, yeah, they can do that one game with the month to prepare when they're at full strength. Can they do that week in and week out? No, they can't. And so that's my thing. I get your point, but nah, I'm sorry. You want to play the easy schedule. Take the easy road. Look at Clemson. They got 2 national titles without them, guys. No. Clemson's got 2 titles. How many does Tennessee have the last? Clemson has more national titles the last 2 years than Tennessee has the last 25. Clemson has more national titles since 1952 than Tennessee. They got 3. Tennessee's got 1.
Portions of the program brought to you by the official craft beer of Off the Hook Sports. It's Zulbeer, xulbeer.com. They've got parking downtown. It is phenomenal beer. Worldwide award-winning craft beer, Zulbeer, xulbeer.com. Elias says I could see a 9-3 SEC team squeezing in at some point. I promise you, Elias, that is going to happen.
That's absolutely going to happen. In the college football, the reason I know you're like this, Dave, I'm not. The reason I liked the Bulls back in the day, everything will be wrong with college football when a 3-loss team wins a national title. I don't like it. I didn't like it when a 2-loss LSU team won the national title. That just didn't look right to me when they did. And when a 3-loss team wins, it's going to look uglier.
Okay, let's look at so right now, I'm going to go based off the AP because they know what they're talking about. The coaches poll is just throwing darts. But the AP, you have Utah at 10-4, so they would make it. Florida State 10-3, so they would make it. and that's 3 regular season losses, by the way. That's not the bowl loss. USC 11-3, and I feel like I missed it. Tulane at 12-2. I don't know what you do with them, but they won. But yeah, I mean, there are teams that are going to make it in with 3 losses. So play the schedule you can. Travis says, I'd rather beat the great teams every single time than to prepare a month and still won. Thank you. Smoky Mountain Red says 12-team playoff will show the weak schedules even more with weaker teams getting in. Yes. And it will also, and when they get hammered in the quarterfinals, then Caleb, you'll be like, man, I wish they'd played a tougher schedule.
It's not, though. The opposite's going to happen, because what's going to happen is that there will be teams that are so fresh for the 12-team playoff. Some teams are going to have to go through a grueling SEC. One, let me say this, too, by the way. If you're an SEC team, because the 12-team playoff is probably going to take, I think you agree with, right, Dave? There's going to be 4 SEC teams year in, year out in this 12-team playoff. There's going to be 4 just from the SEC alone, I think. You don't want to play for the SEC championship if you're going to this playoff. You'd rather be and not play for the title. If we're not going to have divisions anymore, I say ditch the conference title. Ditch it completely. Chuck it. That's a money grab.
Unfortunately, that's going to turn into. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that's going to turn into a money grab too. But I get that. Clemson was pretty fresh this year. Travis says, "How did that work out for them? Not too good."
They didn't care.
Rebecca. Well, they didn't. I mean, that's true. But Rebecca says, think about TCU, weak schedule, get to the Natty, got destroyed. But they did advance to the national championship game. So I see where you're coming from, Rebecca. But to get there, I thought said a lot about TCU. John said, you mean like the South Carolina game? This year we were so much better than that, and they spanked us. TCU was fresh as Georgia. SEC teams in the playoffs are only limited by the number of at-large spots. Amen. There are no automatic qualifiers. There are going to be 4 SEC teams in the college football playoff on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, they take the top 6 conference champions and then the 6 at-large bids. The SEC is going to have an automatic bid with the conference champion, and they're going to have 3 of the 6 at-large bids every year.